This video is based on the 1989 book, Contemporary Glass, published by Harry N. Abrams and written by Suzanne K. France, curator of the 20th Century collection of the Corning Museum of Glass. It traces the developments of glass art, specifically what is known as studio glass, over a 25-year period, also touching upon those artists who came before and influenced it. Unlike the book, the artists whose works are highlighted in this video are primarily those of the United States. And with the exception of pieces used to demonstrate various techniques or illustrate earlier exhibitions, all of the objects presented here are included in the 20th Century collection of the Corning Museum of Glass.
Everyone's always very curious about how you acquire works for a museum and how you stay informed. And it's quite a challenge, and it's also one of the parts of the job that is the most intriguing. Corning is, as far as glass goes, one of the centers of the universe, and we like to think that all the information channels in here. You decide what your collecting policy is, and you try to make it as complete with the highest quality objects that you can possibly acquire. Of course, we always are looking for top quality, but that's very vague and that's sometimes subjective. We have some artists in the collection that have rather informally been picked to focus on, and we try to collect them in depth. That means over their entire careers. Then there are other people that we may only have one example of their work in our collection, but it's a particularly good example that we saw, and we just grabbed it. We try to collect the best of contemporary design in glass. Objects made out of glass that intend to be art or aspire to be art, whether it's painting or sculpture, it's got to hold its own within the realm of contemporary art, and that's very, very tough to do. Sometimes craftsmanship is a factor. On a piece of sculpture where it's not particularly about craftsmanship, in that case we're not looking to see if the joints between sections has been perfectly done. They are so irreverent about the material. They don't have all of these hang-ups about what glass should be. Oh, but that's not glass. Well, who says? So it's just by reading and paying attention and always keeping your ears open and always poking around and keeping an open mind and not just accepting the status quo and what you see touted as the best, but making your own opinion and being educated about your opinion, which is what anyone who collects anything professionally or as an amateur should be doing. Cityscape by Jay Musler has become somewhat of an icon of contemporary glass, and it's almost like a logo for our museum. It's a much loved piece of glass. And what he did was cut it in half, and then he sandblasted those edges that give you the impression of the skyline of a city. And it's such a perfect metaphor for modern city life. Here you don't know if you're seeing a sundown or a sunrise, the orange glow of the vessel. It looks like pollution in the air. You get that real feeling of the contemporary state of American cities, and it's that wonderful combination of a vessel and sculpture at the same time.
Originally, the term studio glass was used to describe glass designed and worked in a molten state, usually blown. This was done by a single artist working in a studio rather than a factory. For years, this term included only glass made after March 1962, when the first glass-blowing workshop for artists was held at the Toledo Museum of Art. Although new, the origins of studio glass can be traced to earlier processes used in both the United States and Europe. To more accurately describe its evolution, a broader definition of studio glass had to be developed. Although crafting the material was attempted by a small number of artists during the first half of the 20th century, the working of glass in its molten state outside the factory was almost non-existent. Eventually, though, artists began to regard non-industrial glass as an artistic medium, beyond decoration and function, thereby laying the foundation for studio glass. Among the early artists to adopt such an attitude were the Frenchman Émile Gallé, the American Louis Comfort Tiffany, and slightly later, the Frenchman René Lalique. Another Frenchman, Maurice Martineau, created internal effects by using an overall entrapment of minute air bubbles and dense powdered glass and metal. In the United States, the Englishman Frederick Carter founded the Steuben Glass Works in 1903 in Corning, New York, from which he emerged as a dominant force in international glass. In later years, Carter devoted his energy to developing various glass molding techniques for his original sculptures. Perhaps his most outstanding achievements were his cast version of ancient Roman carved diatrative vessels, or cage cups. After World War II, the desire to work in hot glass was rekindled simultaneously in the U.S. and abroad. Edris Eckart began to work in glass in 1953 while looking for ways to duplicate Roman gold glass. From the pictorial approach of the gold glass, Eckart turned to working glass sculpturally. Maurice Heaton began kiln-forming plate and bowl forms in the late 40s, and by 1959 he was a master at decorating his work with detailed linear patterns. Colored, crushed enamels were sprinkled onto sheets of flat glass and then heated and fused to the surface. Frances Higgins, who works with her husband Michael, produces unique vessels such as this vase, made in 1958. In it, large granules of colorless glass were heated just to the point of fusing while still retaining the form of each particle. Michael Higgins ingeniously constructed hinged boxes with connecting joints of copper wire screen and folded metal bands fused into the glass. The Corning Museum of Glass opened in 1951 through the patronage of the Corning Glass Works. In its first few years, the museum organized several exhibitions devoted to the history of glass, the most significant in terms of modern glass being the International Survey Glass 1959. One of the first and most important figures in studio glass was Harvey Littleton. Littleton, the son of the director of research for Corning Glass Works, was convinced that the individual craftsman working alone could melt, blow, and anneal glass without it being born in the industry and without having to go through an arduous apprenticeship. The 1960s were years of discovery, exploration, and experimentation for the new studio movement. Learning came almost entirely from trial and error. In contrast to the technical perfection of factory-blown work, the earliest forms of studio glass were what would be expected from novices: heavy, thick vessels and numerous variations on the paperweight. Also, the lack of knowledge about the chemical properties of glass restricted the color palette and types of glasses used. From the first Toledo workshop came strong views regarding priorities for artists that inevitably clashed. First, that of the sculptor, who in search of form was content to push glass in new directions rather than to master techniques. The other view was that of the craftsman, who strove to create a perfectly executed object from the finest glass possible. Harvey Littleton was a strong proponent of the first viewpoint and chose the now infamous phrase, "Technique is cheap." An opposing school of thought was embodied by Littleton's old associate, Dominic Labino. Labino, a glass scientist associated with the glass industry for 50 years, was fascinated by the chemistry of color and worked systematically for years on the development of glass color formulations. In later years, this interest was manifested in cast panels with overlaid glasses, such as the 1980 commission for the new Corning Museum of Glass building. In 1966, the National Invitational Glass Exhibition, presented at San Jose State College, made it clear that most contemporary glass was going to possess a sense of ferment, risk, and exploration. In October, the first Toledo Glass National showed works by 43 artists from 17 states, with blown work dominating. By the mid-1970s, most of the technical knowledge which had been so scarce in the preceding decade was now readily available. So too was the expertise for glass blowing instruction. The rediscovery of the iridization process around 1970 had ushered in numerous imitations of Art Nouveau glass. Different types of molds introduced a wider variety of shapes, and new adhesives allowed glass components to be bonded in ways not possible during hot working. Although already a century old, the technique of sandblasting became the most widely used method of cold surface alteration. This allowed an artist untrained in cutting or engraving to carve the material with relative ease. Artists were able to expand their palette by melting colored glass in multiple small pots placed in the furnace, as well as by the availability of pre-mixed concentrated colorants imported from Europe. With more control over the glass form, artists could finally afford to concentrate on ideas rather than basic techniques. This freedom from technical limitation meant that artistic output was no longer dictated primarily by the natural properties of the material. As a result, the somewhat monotonous sameness of appearance decreased. Many artists completely avoided the vessel shape with its utilitarian association. One of the earliest to work exclusively in a non-objective style was Marvin Lepofsky. Lepofsky, a former Littleton student, exploited the formal potential of blown and manipulated glass while separating it from any allusion to function. During the 70s, a prevailing literal and pictorial style of imagery was influenced by the pop art style and its ceramic offshoot called funk. This style has continued to the present. The imagery you see here was used effectively for making serious commentary on the current political and social upheavals of the late 60s and early 70s. A similarity between op art patterning and the intricacy of the centuries-old Italian Millefiori paperweight technique was deftly noted by Dick Marquis and others. The bold color and graphic design styles of psychedelic, science fiction, and comic book art were likewise widespread. Joel Philip Meyer's Dr. Zarkov's mirror, with its stacked mirror components, appears like a bubble rocket waiting to be launched. Although women had been involved in studio glass blowing almost from its beginning, and had numbered 7 out of the 18 students in the combined Toledo workshops, their numbers through the 60s were few. Joan Bird, Patricia Esch, Audrey Handler, Minona Rousseau, Ruth Tamura, and Sylvia Vigiletti were among the first to disprove the misconception that women could not build furnaces, stand the intense heat of a glass studio, or handle the heavy weight of glass on the end of a blowpipe. In the 70s, a prominent artist educator emerged, Dale Chihuly. He was an early leader in exploring the sculptural possibilities of glass. Architectural projects done with James Carpenter followed, such as the Corning Wall, which was created in 1974. Beginning in 1977, came increasingly elaborate variations on sets of glass baskets, nested C-forms, and flowers. Like Littleton, Chihuly contributed to glass education and its promotion as a sculptural medium. In 1971, he and his patrons founded the Pilchuck Glass Center. Renamed the Pilchuck Glass School in 1976, it has proven to be one of the most innovative forces in contemporary glass. In contrast to the rural setting, spaciousness, and educational focus of Pilchuck, the metropolitan-based New York Experimental Glass Workshop appeared in 1971. As a nonprofit studio, it was founded as a support structure for artists and has offered year-round courses, gallery space, and rental facilities. Another nonprofit organization, the Creative Glass Center of America, opened its hot glass facility in 1983 in association with the Museum of American Glass of Wheaton Village in Millvale, New Jersey. The museum has an extensive collection of glass, both contemporary and historical. In 1979, the Corning Museum of Glass presented New Glass, a worldwide survey. The contrast between New Glass and Glass 1959 graphically illustrated the startling changes that had taken place in 20 years. The New Glass exhibition had the effect of highlighting several long-simmering issues as it ushered in the 1980s. With the inclusion of both functional and non-functional pieces, the exhibition demonstrated that the common thread of medium alone was no longer a sufficient binder. Should the new work be considered art, craft or design? Contributing to the ambiguity was the recurring form that did not fit within the traditional definitions of sculpture, namely the non-functional vessel. These sculptural vessels were resisted as art by many critics, curators, collectors, art historians, and art dealers alike.
There's a lot of different factors going on here for people who are really trying to understand what's happening with this material and understand it within the art world and the design world and the craft world. And a lot of times they overlap, and a lot of the area is gray. They blend into each other. And that's what makes it interesting, too. There are just no more firm rules anymore about art, craft, or design. And we're right in the middle of this big flux. It's all melted together, so to speak, and people who try to categorize it have big problems. You have to be flexible.
The confusion between craft, sculpture, and decorative art, functional and non-functional wear, had a retarding effect on the acquisition of studio glass by art museums. Glass that had seemed appropriate for a temporary showing did not necessarily receive consideration for a permanent collection. Around 1974, the Corning Museum of Glass made the decision to undertake an aggressive collecting policy for contemporary glass of all types, with a focus on glass sculpture. The museum has since compiled one of the largest collections of international post-1962 work in the world. The concerns and trends of the 70s deepened in the 80s, where artists in earlier years were driven to experiment in their struggle for information about the medium. Now techniques were selected like colors from a palette. Glass blowing, the process that had so fascinated the Toledo workshop members, declined in prevalence. Instead, variations of kiln forming and cold working offered greater physical options. Artists such as Robin Feinberg incorporated various metals with their works through a process of electroplating.
The first thing that I have to do the electroforming is make the glass electrically conductive. And the way I would do that is by making a paint that's electrically conductive that can be powdered copper or silver. There will be an electric current, a direct current, that will be passed through it, and the particles of copper will attach. The piece will be immersed into a solution of distilled water, diluted sulfuric acid, and copper sulfate. This pinkish matte color is typical of how a good plating should appear when it's completed. I just go over most of the metal with a very fine steel wool. And then to pick up some of the highlights along the edges, I'll file the edges or burnish them with a burnisher.
New artists from other media came onto the scene, often bringing only concepts and employing glass craftsmen to execute their ideas. Many stalwart defenders of the view that the artist's hand must be seen in all aspects of production revised their thinking in 1976 when Dale Chihuly lost the vision in one eye and was forced to give up working the glass himself. The result has further tempered the attitudes of the past years and blurred the distinction of the artist as either craftsman or designer. Although the term studio glass remains convenient, it has gradually become more broadly defined. Included now is the whole spectrum of hot and cold techniques used in both one-of-a-kind and limited edition works. Today, artist-designed works in glass are not necessarily made by the same person or even by one person working alone. They may be produced in the factory as well as the studio. Regardless, The most recent years of studio glass have firmly established glass as a legitimate medium for the artist.
Because now glass is so accessible to, it's accessible to almost anybody now. And more artists who have no craft background, no association with glass, are discovering this material. If an artist wants to throw paint on it, if an artist wants to combine it with dirt or straw, why not? We just have to keep our minds open to that, as well as the most exquisitely blown traditional vase that you can imagine.